One last time, it's 8:07. Speaking first on the pro-affirmative. Everybody's not ready. Oh, everybody's ready. Time starts now. Ode and I affirm resolve the United States should establish a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. Contention 1 is economic growth. Taiwan has been subject to devastating economic coercion from China for generations. The CRS notes in 2019, Taiwan's exports have fallen by a third because Beijing bullies other countries to exclude Taiwan from trade agreements. Thankfully, Dustinberg 21 finds a free trade agreement with Taiwan would allow the United States to better access Taiwanese food and energy sectors, while simultaneously increasing Taiwanese investment in U.S. businesses, facilitating the exchange of goods and investment, booming Taiwan's economy. Smith 22 terminalizes that total trade would increase by $10 billion annually. More importantly, however, a trade agreement would unlock the doors to Taiwan internationally. The United States, as China's only rival in power, is the only country capable of globally integrating Taiwan with a bilateral trade agreement. Sachs 21 explains that a U.S.-Taiwan bilateral trade agreement would provide the political cover necessary for Asian and European states to establish deals with Taipei. Rosen of the Peterson Institute confirms that Asian nations have long stated that a U.S.-Taiwan bilateral trade agreement will break the impasse with Japan, Singapore, and South Korea directly following Washington's lead and ratifying trade deals with Taiwan. Therefore, the U.S.-Taiwan bilateral trade agreement will set off a resurgence in free trade, which the World Bank 21 finds could lift 27 million people to middle-class status by 2035. Contention 2 is deterrence. Bluth 22 explains that the United States' position of strategic ambiguity, neither committing nor relinquishing the right to militarily protect Taiwan, may be fading, and the U.S. needs to clarify and strengthen its commitments. For example, Blitzer just 2 weeks ago finds just a day after saying he would defend Taiwan, Biden said there is no policy change and the U.S. does not support Taiwan's independence. This has sparked Chinese aggression. Culver in 2021 writes, Xi Jinping has recently framed reunification as a requirement for achieving the China dream. Culver adds that this will lead the Chinese president to take risks that his more constrained predecessors would not. And Dengwall in 2022 confirmed Chinese leadership will move towards armed unification by 2027. Lee elaborates that the risk of conflict is the highest in decades as China sends aircraft into Taiwanese territory daily. Just last month, the United States Secretary of State said Taiwan is on the front lines of China's attacks. The window for protection is closing, as Professor Latham of the Hill in 2021 explains that previous barriers to invasion for China, namely lackluster military spending, leaders without a focus on Taiwanese reunification, and a prior lack of sufficient nuclear weapons, are now gone. After China was embarrassingly deterred by the United States in the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1996, Beijing began modernizing their military rapidly. Xi has made reunifying Taiwan a top priority, and China has reached nuclear parity with the United States that puts a nuclear exchange out of the question. Even worse, Latham finds that Chinese upgrades have been specifically geared towards denying U.S. forces from the region and forming a blockade. Thankfully, we have time. Latham continues that China is currently not equipped to launch an invasion of the island because of lacking amphibious assault capabilities. However, they further say that if the U.S. can't help Taiwan and conventionally deter Beijing, China will invade Taiwan within 6 years based on current trends. Action needs to be taken urgently. Sachs 21 explains that as China's military strength increases, the U.S. needs to find additional ways to help Taiwan deter war. A trade deal would do just that. Specifically, the Cato Institute finds that the trade agreement would improve Taiwan's ability to deter China through increased defense investment. Cole of Thinking Taiwan in 2014 writes that the U.S. defense sector could invest in Taiwan's indigenous defense industry, giving them the reins for the development of their own military, preparing them better while preventing Chinese retaliation by keeping such investment low profile as opposed to arms sales. Cohen 21 verifies that international intervention will make a Taiwan invasion a significant political and military risk for China. Affirming is crucial as Everington 21 found that an invasion of Taiwan would be deadly, with the country suffering 240,000 casualties as a result of its small size and dense population. For those reasons, Ode and I are very proud to affirm.
Yeah, can we just see that defense investment increases within the agreement?
The Cato Institute.
Yeah. Alright, starting now. Got it. That was 3 seconds.
Alright, is anyone not ready? Again, this is 784 on speaking next second. We negate the resolution resolved. The United States should establish a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. Our sole contention is destabilizing Asia. Since the introduction of the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979, the U.S. has promoted Taiwan's security and economy. In fact, the Congressional Research Service finds in 2022 that U.S.-Taiwan trade increased by 25% last year, and Taiwanese exports to the U.S. have increased more than 69% in the past 3 years. China has been appeased under one condition, that the U.S. avoids direct recognition of Taiwan's sovereignty. However, a bilateral trade agreement, which Chinese foreign ministers have stated last week, signals recognition of sovereignty, would shift Beijing's calculus and disrupt the current peace in East Asia. Indeed, the Chinese Foreign Ministry declared last year that China firmly opposes any official U.S.-Taiwan agreements and will take firm retaliatory countermeasures. Although reunification with Taiwan has been a Chinese goal for decades, Scoville of Columbia University 22 finds that Xi Jinping has instead focused on building China's reputation as a peaceful economic powerhouse. As such, the CCP has not fought a war since Vietnam in 1979. However, affirming would disrupt the stability in the region in two key ways, and the first is through economic retaliation. Dobbins 11 of the Rand Corporation finds that China's go-to tool of intimidation is through cutting trade ties. In fact, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations 22 finds that China has routinely tried pressuring Taiwan's government into making diplomatic concessions by blocking off fruit imports, crushing the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese farmers. A bilateral trade agreement would trigger similar sanctions, as Jennings of UC Berkeley 16 writes that although China accepts informal relations, a sudden establishment of official ties with Taiwan would result in economic retaliation against Taiwanese exports. Chen 13 of Harvard University finds that because Taiwan's electronics production is complementary with that of China's industries, sanctions would devastate Taiwanese trade. In particular, Lau 22 of the South China Morning Post finds that China would coerce Taiwan into negotiations by blocking off natural gas and oil imports, grinding the economy to a halt while rendering the trade agreement null. Even an announcement would scare off trade to the point where Taiwan's reserves would be exhausted in weeks, pushing hundreds of thousands of people into poverty. The second is provoking conflict. When the U.S. and Taiwan last entertained the idea of a bilateral trade agreement in 2001, McDaniel 21 finds that antagonistic anti-U.S. Taiwan propaganda subsequently skyrocketed in China. Even worse, Myers 21 of the New York Times finds that increased anti-U.S. propaganda is usually coupled with a series of military drills such as ballistic missile tests and the buzzing of Taiwan's airspace in 2020. This signals that China won't back down from a military confrontation. Devastatingly, Myers concludes that these moves will become a self-fulfilling prophecy where if Xi Jinping feels challenged, he's unable to back down because the propaganda entraps the public in a combative stance and forces Xi to climb the stairs to escalation. An ensuing conflict would be disastrous, as Lowther 13 finds that since the U.S. must uphold defense commitments, Chinese-Taiwanese conflict would draw in the U.S. and threaten billions of people. Indeed, Fisher 20 reports that even a conventional conflict would kill millions of Taiwanese. Escalating regional tensions also destabilize international trade flows, as Bloomberg 18 explains that trade remains concentrated on increasingly vulnerable routes that, when disrupted, become choke points in the global food supply, spiking prices and cutting off millions. To protect millions of innocent lives, we are so proud to negate.
Yeah. Can I see the Jennings evidence on the first subpoint?
Yep.
Can I see that Taiwan would run out of reserves in weeks?
I'll get one by one.
Okay, yeah, sounds good.
Jennings.
Okay, that's fine. That's seven.
What was the other one?
The thing that Taiwan would run out of reserves in weeks, and China cutting off those. Okay. It's Lao part?
Yeah.
Oh, where's the weeks part?
Um,
On the part about reserves.
there's more on the bottom.
Okay. No, that's fine for now. Yeah, that's 15.
If you're taking credit for that, can you just let us know how much it is?
15.
Yeah, that's 15. Yeah.
We'll take slightly more per cross. Time start. Okay. That was 5 more seconds, so that's 20.
Yeah.
How much did you say it was?
20 total.
20 total? Cool. I've had like 3 rounds recently where people have forgotten how much prep they took, so I don't know.
We're pretty good at it, I promise.
Okay. I think the questions.
Yeah, sure.
So you mentioned at the top of your case the Taiwan Relations Act from 1979, right?
Yeah.
So if that doesn't get reversed during this resolution, how do we officially recognize Taiwan?
The problem is that we didn't recognize Taiwan in the Taiwan Relations Act.
Exactly. We don't recognize them. The Taiwan Relations Act outlines how we will diplomatically have relations with Taiwan, but we're not officially recognizing them.
Yes, and
If that
our
doesn't go
argument
away-
is that recognizing them as sovereign nation is really bad for our
But how would it, so I'm not sure how this recognition of sovereign nation happens.
So that's what the Chinese foreign minister said in a public meeting just last week, where they said that China's red line in the sand is a bilateral trade agreement. If the US were to sign an official bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan, then Chinese foreign minister said that China will view this as a declaration or a recognition of sovereignty, and they will take firm retaliatory countermeasures. That's specifically what they don't want. Can I get a question?
Of course.
What specifically does political cover mean?
So other countries can see, like no one country wants to be the first to start relations or begin a trade deal with Taiwan, as the threats from you just read from China prove. So the United States, if they're the first one, other countries will be like, oh, I want to follow in the United States footsteps.
Okay, so why didn't the other countries follow, like New Zealand or other countries that signed bilateral trade agreements with Taiwan?
Because the United States is much larger.
So if the United States wants to sign a bilateral trade agreement and they don't care about Chinese retaliation, then that means the other countries will follow.
It's not about not caring. Like, there's risks in everything, but if the United States does it and it's safe, other countries will follow.
So here's the problem, right? Why was Taiwan excluded from the Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor negotiations then?
Because other countries were scared of China.
Exactly.
Right.
So the U.S. was not, well, the U.S. certainly has nothing to lose because the U.S.'s economy is a lot more powerful. So that means that even though the U.S. was lobbying for Taiwan in these negotiations, these other countries are still not following the U.S. and are still scared, and they're still not going to sign on other agreements even if we affirm.
Exactly. They were lobbying for them in negotiations, but unless something concrete has been passed, like a bilateral trade agreement that shows the United States' action, not just talk, then other countries will follow.
So even though
question.
in the trade negotiations, the U.S. said, look, I think that we should actually include Taiwan in these trade negotiations, and if you do, we will support you, even though they explicitly came out and said that and came out with a promise during these negotiations, these countries still don't think that the U.S. is credible.
Because I just responded to that. They did not
Alright.
officially form a bilateral trade agreement. That's what our evidence indicates is specifically key.
Sure, but
Let's
let's talk
talk
about
about
the rebuttal. Go ahead.
Let's talk about the bottom of your case.
Yeah.
You say the United States would be forced to militarily intervene.
Yeah.
Can you explain how that happens? If they have strategic ambiguity, they can either choose to or not to.
Right, so that's your own link, right?
Right.
Even though it's ambiguous to China right now, the U.S. has to uphold their defense commitments to Taiwan.
Mhm.
So a Chinese-Taiwanese conflict would draw in the United States. They would have to intervene and help out Taiwan, and that's going to trigger your own conflict scenario.
That's
We both
not-
have the same impact.
That's
so
not,
that's a problem.
no, but that, can I answer that really
Sure.
quickly? That's not true because the Taiwan Relations Act doesn't say we will absolutely defend Taiwan.
Right.
It says we have the right, but we may not. Exactly, that's when Biden said we will defend Taiwan. An hour later, the White House was like, nope, there's no policy change. We're not changing our policy.
Well,
we have the right and also not the right
We
to.
have
So
evidence
there's no change.
indicating that the U.S. will go in and protect Taiwan.
Yeah, can I see
follow
that?
Well, we didn't read it yet, so we can read it in rebuttal.
You just
Wait,
brought
wasn't
it
it
in
in
Crossfire.
case? You said U.S. must help Taiwan.
The U.S. did sign a defense commitment
Yeah, I'm just
with
calling for
Taiwan.
it.
Sure, we can do it.
Just those two.
Can you zoom in a little bit?
Time starts.
Which part of it talks about the like?
So it's about how it's not an official agreement, but it's that they will come to their defense.
Like which part says that they will as well? That's like a lot of.
Yeah, this first.
First paragraph. All right. Okay, that's 6. And I also see that trade routes get cut off. That's 26 total, by the way. No, like the trade routes, not like them blocking.
This is our argument about like the historical what.
Okay, that's fine. That's number 4. 30 use total. We'll use more time in like 1 second. All right, starting now. That was another 30, where you use a minute. The order will be an overview, then down case. The overview should be put at the top of their case if you have space. Anyone not ready? Start at the top of their case. All of their arguments about how free trade agreements or bilateral trade agreements with Taiwan anger China are empirically false. Just a few years ago, Perry reported that New Zealand formed a comprehensive free trade agreement with Taiwan, and it did not trigger Chinese escalation. The Perry evidence concludes that this is because they use the World Trade Organization's definition of Taiwan, which is not Taiwan as a sovereign nation, but rather Taiwan as the islands of Taiwan, which avoids any of the official relationships that they talk about. The card is very explicit in saying that China does not consider these things as official relationships and instead considers them strictly in the trade domain, which doesn't trigger any of their impacts. If China was willing to retaliate, it would have been much easier to do when New Zealand was involved because they're a much less powerful state, and they didn't, which proves they certainly won't with the United States. They also prove that they won't with the United States with the uniqueness they read. First, the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 literally says that we will never recognize Taiwanese independence, which means regardless of what they're saying China will perceive, it is in writing in U.S. doctrines, and the White House has backed it up this month that the United States does not recognize Taiwanese independence. What this means is that no matter what the United States does with trade, it never actually triggers China, which is why they say that trade has been exponentially increasing in the last year, yet China has not done any of the things they lash out about. They're going to get up here and say that an official declaration is what angers China, but that doesn't make sense. China would be upset if Taiwan is materially getting more distant from China. Trade does that. It's not about what the paper says, and if they've been trading and China isn't upset, it empirically disproves their case. On the next argument they read, they say that China opposes any sort of official agreements. Remember to call for our Perry evidence. Then they say that Xi wants China to be peaceful. That is empirically disproven. Since the 1996 embarrassment in the third Taiwan Strait crisis, where the United States did deter China successfully, China has been rapidly militarizing in order to block the U.S. from ever being able to do that again, and to make an invasion of Taiwan very simple. Our Hill evidence from 2021 explains that China is about 6 years away from launching an amphibious invasion on Taiwan, but does not have the infrastructure now. This is why you need to affirm, because this bilateral trade agreement allows Taiwan to build up the necessary defense to deter that invasion. They're going to say that Xi is an irrational actor, but it doesn't. But our evidence concludes that Xi does operate on a cost-benefit analysis scale, and if the costs are too high for an invasion, it does nothing for his legitimacy or popularity. You only raise the cost with an affirmative ballot. Then on their first subpoint about economic retaliation, they say that we blocked fruit imports. I'm glad they brought this up, because when China blocked pineapple imports from Taiwan, other nations like Japan stepped up and bought the fruits. This also disproves their impact, because if China cuts off any sort of energy to Taiwan, other nations would gladly import it, or if they cut off Taiwanese exports, other nations will take it. This is largely because what Taiwan is exporting is very important to most countries. Things like agriculture or semiconductors at that are extremely crucial things that any economy would want to take in, which is why they were putting #freedom pineapples samples on every Instagram page and buying up these fruits for Taiwan. Next, they say that China can block Taiwanese energy imports. Unlucky for Taiwan, China is not the one importing energy to them. Our evidence finds that it's mostly the Middle East, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries that send them their coal and oil, and that China is useless. Also, their evidence never says that their reserves would run out in weeks. That is made up by them. I called for the card and asked for the specific part about weeks. That's not true, which means that you can safely believe that Taiwan has enough reserves and support from other countries to make it out of any sort of energy crisis. Next on their argument, next on the conflict argument, they say that the people would force escalation into Taiwan. That is not true in a country like China. When China has state-owned media and can literally control the narrative of their government, as they have during the coronavirus, it is very clear that the people have no control over what the government does. Next, they say that the United States must help Taiwan, but you saw the disaster of a card read. That is not true. The card never says that they must help them, and all it says is that the United States can send defense to Taiwan, which is what we are arguing. You help Taiwan defend themselves. The United States does not have to step into any sort of conflict per the Taiwan Relations Act that they cite and our strategic ambiguity doctrine. Lastly, they say that trade routes will be cut off during a war. One, I urge you to look at Google Maps and look at how close China is to Taiwan. There are no trade routes that go through that strait that deliver food across the globe. And two, the card is about sanctions and says nothing about trade routes being cut off during war. That's not what their evidence says. Vote after peace.
Can we say that Taiwan will be okay if China cuts off their gas?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a bit of time before rebuttal.
How much have you all used up to now?
3 seconds.
Oh, cool.
Okay. Resuming prep now. Okay, that was 34 seconds.
How much prep did you guys?
34, so 37 total now.
Perfect.
Alright. Is everyone good? Cool. We're just going to be starting on the negative case, then moving on to the affirmative. So if everyone's good, then we'll start time now. We are already increasing trade with Taiwan. Remember, we tell you we've been eliminating tariffs. We've been boosting trade exports for the past several decades under the Taiwan Relations Act. The key distinction is that a bilateral trade agreement is a political move. It signals to China that we are recognizing Taiwan, or even best, it signals that we are moving them away, which is exactly what threatens them and forces them to retaliate. On our case, the first thing they say is that the retaliation is empirically false because of New Zealand. This is just taken out of context because the key distinction with New Zealand is that they've always kept trade low with Taiwan. Sure, maybe they had a bilateral trade agreement, but the US is the much larger economic threat to China as they have a larger economy, which is why historically, every single time we negotiate a trade deal with Taiwan, like we were negotiating a Pacific trade deal last year, China's been more aggressive than ever, like when they had more jet flyovers than ever before. But then, we would say that that the key distinction is it just isn't about sovereignty. More so, we would say that when the US trades with Taiwan, it signals to China that they are losing their influence over the country. That not only A, draws attention to Taiwan, which makes China look weak, but B, it means they lose things like semiconductors they rely on. That's ultimately why they take aggressive actions. Then, they say that Xi doesn't want peace and he's militarizing right now. Sure, we would say that's not for a Taiwanese invasion, it's for the same reasons they talk about. Xi just wants to decrease reliance on the US and be more powerful. This would occur whether or not we have a bilateral trade agreement, but I'll talk more about why an invasion will never happen. Then, they say the pineapple imports were never bad in the first place. Yes, Japan was able to buy the fruit. If anything, that indicates that right now, Taiwan is already forging relationships with other countries and you don't need an agreement. But B, we would say that when you block things like oil and gas, that 90% comes from China, then Japan won't be able to fill in. You can't have any actor making up all of that overnight. Then, they say that other countries are supplying energy. Okay, if they had read our evidence, they would have said, yes, other countries are supplying the energy, but all of it goes through Chinese contracting companies, which means that a Chinese blockade could effectively shut Taiwan off overnight. They wouldn't be able to do anything and ever diversify in the first place. With that, let's talk about their case, starting on this idea of a Taiwanese invasion being inevitable. First, Ullman of the Atlantic Council this year explains that China lacks the military capabilities to seize Taiwan as the coast is already heavily guarded and they lack a geographical advantage. Even if they can succeed, we would say the costs always outweigh the benefits because again, the only reason they want to take over Taiwan is to appear strong. If they never look weak in the first place, that incentive doesn't exist. But then, on this idea of economic growth, first, a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement is not needed as trade between the US and Taiwan is already on a continued rise. In 2021, trade grew by 25% and Taiwan's exports to the US have been on an upward trend as shown in 2018 and 2021 when they increased by 69%. But second, we would say our allies are not going to trade with Taiwan regardless of an agreement. That is because Asian economy's primary trading partner is always China. If the US trades with Taiwan, sure, they'll be fine because they get 10% of their exports from China. However, if Japan does, for example, the Prime Minister will not be able to explain to his people how 40% of their exports disappear overnight. Again, the US's political cover just doesn't do enough. Then, we would see with Lithuania, for example, they just opened a Taiwanese embassy last year and their economy was shut down by China, which is why ultimately in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework discussions, no country wanted to go along with the US and none believed that the US's political cover would be enough. They didn't include Taiwan. But finally, countries like India are already pouring new investment into Taiwan, which shows if anything, economic growth should be inevitable, but we would tell you the US is already doing that right now. Let's talk about their case about an invasion. First, we would say that Shattuck 22 finds that Taiwan Relations Act has existed for decades and enabled the US to sell arms to Taiwan, which is why they've increased spending by billions of dollars. But second, the US can always retaliate economically, which would be more detrimental to China. That includes things like a sanctions from all of these Western countries and also a US naval blockade, which is why, again, China never has an incentive to invade unless we have an agreement. But third and finally, we would say that ultimately our argument short-circuits it. If Taiwan's economy cannot function as a result of them blocking imports, then that means China has all influence. Taiwan can't do anything to bolster defenses. Ultimately, there's no reason to have this political signal.
Two pieces of evidence.
Yep.
First one, you said 90% of oil and gas. Is that the same as the contracting company's one?
Yeah.
Let me see the part that says 90%.
And then the contracting price.
I can't check on your website.
It's this paragraph.
98. LNGs.
That's fine.
Alright. Ready for cross?
Yeah. Actually, no, I'm gonna need a second, bro.
We used 106 total by 9. Time starts now. Alright,
Wait, also, sorry. Can I just see that evidence for like one word, like second?
that's 114 total up to now.
I can come up. Okay, that was 1 second.
Are you good? I'm good. Yeah. I'm good for Crossfire. You ready? Can I get the first question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Alright, so the evidence I just read says 98% of Taiwan's natural gas comes through LNG.
The LNG market.
What is LNG?
I don't know, but I'm saying that that same evidence says that China controls the market for Taiwan because almost all of it goes through those firms.
But LNG is not a firm.
Yeah,
LNG
I
is
know,
an abbreviation
but
for liquefied
China
natural
controls,
gas.
yes, China controls the liquefied natural gas going into Taiwan because, again, the evidence indicates that they're the ones that are facilitating that trade.
I know.
Sure, it comes from Qatar, it comes from all these countries, but China is the one who's bringing it to Taiwan. That's why the blockade is so detrimental, and that's why the first piece of evidence you called for at the beginning of the round says they could shut down Taiwan.
I know that this fits your narrative well, but the card you just showed me just doesn't say that it comes through China. You tried to show me a thing that says 98% is through LNG and said that that was a Chinese
And
company.
then the following note, LNG is not a Chinese company. The following line says that China is the one who is facilitating all of this trade. And the first piece of evidence we showed you says the same thing. The reason that China can shut down Taiwan is not because they're supplying the energy, or not because they're the source of the oil, but because they're the ones that are transporting it to Taiwan.
Okay, you can have a question.
Cool. So let's talk about this whole, okay, actually, what are just the incentives for China to invade Taiwan?
It's something that Xi has put on his top radar. It's something that right now would be, quite frankly, if the U.S. doesn't do anything and there's no app ballot, would be pretty easy. And they say he's pretty rational. They say he's just a cost-benefit actor. And
so,
yep.
Is it, for example, Chinese credibility? Is it appealing to his people? Specifically,
our evidence concludes that this is something that Xi has put a lot of emphasis on, but will still act rationally about if the costs grow too much.
So it's just that Xi has put attention on it.
Xi has put attention on it. I mean, there's also just economic benefits of having Taiwan.
Okay, what are
the same things you
economic
talked about? Like controlling things like the industries in Taiwan would be beneficial to Xi.
Okay,
Can I get a
that's
question?
fine. Go ahead.
So when responding to me saying that other nations have stepped in to help with pineapples and you do the same with energy, you said that this means that Taiwan is already forging relationships with outside countries. Why has China not invaded or done something that you say they would do in retaliation to this behavior?
Because specifically two things. A, they're still predominantly trading with China. We're saying that in the case of this retaliation, right now we can bail them out. For example, that's what Japan has done. However, when the US violates the sole red line that China has put forward, that's when they retaliate, that's when they look weak. Japan buying pineapples doesn't make China look as weak as the US instituting a bilateral trade agreement, which they haven't done for the past 3 decades.
Okay. You can have a question.
Cool. Actually, you can take another.
All right, why can't the United States give Taiwan oil?
Why can't the US?
They have a BTA.
The US has much less oil. And also the US...
The US has less oil?
Yeah, the US has much less oil than the other countries who are supplying Taiwan. And also the US could give Taiwan oil right now. I don't see how that changes under a BTA.
Yeah, because Taiwan doesn't need it. Assuming that this evidence is true and China gives it to Taiwan, if we sign a BTA with the United States, why can the United States not give them the same energy resources?
So that's the whole issue. We're saying that to diversify away from China and for the US to supply all this energy, it can't just happen overnight. You can't create all those connections, which is why a bilateral trade agreement takes time. The shutting off of energy could be instantaneous, and that's ultimately why any threat of economic retaliation comes first. That's the way.
All right, we'll take care of this.
That was 40 seconds.
Yeah, can I just see the line we talked about in cross? I should have called that right after cross.
The same.
The thing, the line you referenced in Crossfire from the China stuff.
Yeah. Here. Oh, yeah, Taiwan's sole LNG importer.
And then also importers.
Social media thing as well. Okay, we're starting to time it now. Okay, that's fine. That's 15. We have used 2 minutes and 4 seconds.
That was 38 more seconds, so Odin. Odin's good.
8.
Wait, can you repeat that one more time? Sorry.
We have 8 seconds left.
It's starting on our case. Yeah. Is anybody not ready? Well, good. Time starts now. We think all of our arguments are true, but there's one that was really mishandled, and that's our contention 2 on deterrence. Remember the Latham evidence, which indicates that China currently does not have the capabilities to invade. They do not have amphibious assault vehicles. However, in the coming years, they're still rapidly militarizing and modernizing their military, which will allow them to reunify with Taiwan or try to launch an invasion of Taiwan, something that Xi has made a national priority. Our argument is very simple, that a bilateral trade agreement means more defense investment into Taiwan's indigenous defense in their military, so they can build up the capabilities to deter China. They can see that China's going to invade by 2027, so the uniqueness is on our side. Insofar that's true, the only thing you can do is vote out to prevent 240,000 people from dying. They give you a few responses. Their first response says that China lacks the capability. That's exactly our argument. They currently lack the capability, but they've conceded our argument that within the next 6 years they're going to get those capabilities, which is why now is key. Their second argument says that the United States can sell arms, but they've conceded our argument that selling arms is just not enough. We need increase in defense investment into Taiwan itself to build up their military capabilities so they can defend themselves as well. The third argument says that the United States would retaliate economically, but no, this would just hurt their own economy, because they tell you themselves the whole world is interconnected. The only reason that China would go for Taiwan is because they feel like they would get something from Taiwan. It's been a matter of national pride. Their last argument says that the economy wouldn't function as per their case, but also if there was an invasion of Taiwan, in Taiwan, semiconductor factories didn't work, which semiconductors are super important for manufacturing their automobiles, everything. That would shut down the manufacturing of the entire world, which would also cause the same economic collapse. This is pretty circular. This is the only defined impact in the round, 240,000. If you vote for them, you don't know what you're voting for. Go to their case, the argument about New Zealand ends the round. Our argument is very simple, that New Zealand sent a bilateral, comprehensive trade agreement with Taiwan, and nothing happened. They give you a few responses. Their first response says it is a political move, but they've conceded our Perry evidence, which is absolutely fantastic, which indicates that China would not see it as political, but only economic, because they understand it is just strictly economic. Their second argument says, no, but they just see it as Taiwan moving away. Then their case should have triggered. They tell you themselves in the past 3 years, exports have risen by 69%. If that's true and the name on the ticket doesn't matter, then their case should have triggered some sort of economic retaliation. The fact is that China is all talk. They're not in action, which is why in the past they've always made threats, but they've never followed up. Their final argument says Taiwan, New Zealand is keeping trade low. No, because they tell you themselves it's just a signal drifting, and if a country starts to trade with Taiwan, as they tell you it's bad, then it should have triggered something. On their case, you can extend the argument that Japan stepped up and got the pineapples, or that other countries can just step up. They say a few things. First, they tell you they're already forging trade ties, so if they're already forging trade ties, their impact should have happened. Two, they say that all the gas goes through China. Other countries that are still exporting oil have a say. They don't want to alienate their allies, like Qatar, Malaysia, etc. They talk about in their own evidence, not going to say, oh, you can't sell the oil, and especially because they want to expand their geopolitical influence, those countries are still going to be able to sell their oil. Finally, they've conceded that they have reserves, so they can just last themselves.
Can we say 6 years?
Yeah, leave them.
can we see that China only sees a bilateral trade agreement as an economic
Can you give
action?
Perry? Like, this is the whole Kirby site, but 6 years is at. You're fine. It says 6 years right here.
That was 1 second.
I mean, this is the part that talks about official relationships.
Alright, we'll resume prep starting.
Oh, yeah.
Pause prep, can we get that Taiwan has enough oil reserves?
Yeah.
It's this paragraph.
Got it.
Resume prep now.
So how much prep would that be?
2:51. So we have 9 seconds.
Alright, is anyone not ready? It's going to start at our pace, go on to weighing, and then their pace. The easiest way to vote negative is on our first argument about economic retaliation. Currently, China-Taiwan international relations are in the Goldilocks zone, where trade with Taiwan has been increasing, but China has been appeased. A bilateral trade agreement is the red line in the sand for China, as it would be perceived as an endorsement of Taiwanese sovereignty calling for retaliation. This would take the form of economic retaliation, with China cutting off exports and imports, devastating Taiwan's economy, and pushing hundreds of thousands of people into poverty. They tell you New Zealand didn't face repercussions for establishing a trade agreement. They've conceded what Vidash tells you. These agreements were formed a decade ago in 2013. China's economy is now 50% larger than it was then, so their leverage over countries is much greater. But B, New Zealand is a tiny island nation that isn't a major threat to China, as opposed to the US being the largest economy in the world. But what really matters here is that that they say it's not an actual declaration of sovereignty as their warrant for why China doesn't care about New Zealand. It doesn't matter what it actually is, it's what China perceives, because both arguments are reliant on China's reaction. And China's reaction is that a bilateral trade agreement signals U.S. recognition of Taiwanese sovereignty, which their own foreign minister stated will lead to Chinese retaliation. Don't take it from Perry, take it from China about what China actually thinks. But B, even aside from the declaration of sovereignty, the U.S. violating a policy that China explicitly said is their bottom line makes China look weak, which is why they lash out. That is our link. They also tell you that Taiwan recovered after the pineapple tariff. A, they tell you themselves the reason why Taiwan recovered because of US and Japanese trade, which happens in our world, but B, a complete shutdown of oil and gas, which 98% of imports to Taiwan are controlled by China when you affirm, is uniquely going to push millions of people into poverty. They say our impact should have happened, but they only happen when you make an official statement and the bilateral trade agreement. That is our argument. They also finally say that Taiwan already has oil reserves and they'll be fine. Sure, they'll be fine for a couple of months, maybe a couple of years, but these oil reserves are not enough, which is why they're continuously dependent on China and increasingly more so. That's why our arguments always come before theirs, is because our argument short circuits theirs. China and Taiwan are so economically intertwined that Chinese retaliation will ruin and devastate Taiwan's economy, devastating their ability to defend themselves. If a Chinese invasion were to happen, it collapses instantaneously. But another incredibly easy way to vote negative is on the voter about Taiwanese invasion, which is both of our arguments. China's main geopolitical strategy with Taiwan is to increase its influence through peaceful activities such as trade and diplomacy, which is why despite decades of supposed warnings of Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it never happened. They talk a lot about violations and small-scale provocation. They've dropped that the only times China flew planes and threatened Taiwan was after talks of a Pacific trade deal. This is what specifically triggers China to lash out. That's our argument. Whenever the US and Taiwan seem like they're about to make a bilateral trade agreement, China lashes out because of public backlash, spurring propaganda, and triggering that conflict that kills millions of people. They say that the US economy is going to be hurt by sanctions. We sanctioned Russia because of an invasion as well, so we're going to do it to the China as well. But also it's a new argument that China will have semiconductors and the US is already diversifying. It's a very clean ballot for the negative for 780.
Alright, are y'all ready for Grand?
Yeah.
You can take the first question.
Okay. So let's talk about your argument that Taiwan will not have oil, right? Like they will run out of energy too fast for anyone to come in, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if the card you called for says that Taiwan has 60 days of energy reserves minimum as a national law, how is that not enough time, especially given a trade agreement or the current trade we already have that you say is booming, to bring energy to Taiwan?
That's what Videsh told you in second cross, right? Like, the US doesn't have enough oil. It's just true that China has a lot more oil, which is why Taiwan is getting a lot of their oil and gas right now from China as opposed to the US.
So it's two things, right? A, even if you prove that the US can fill in, we would say that all of that oil being shut off, even for a temporary time, would signal Taiwan as being pretty screwed over, and that's why their economy falters. That's what causes millions of people to go into poverty. But even further, we would say that it's not just limited to oil. Again, almost all trade could be blocked by Taiwan, by China, which is what our evidence indicates. So again, Taiwan would not be able to function without China.
You get on question.
You can go.
Let's talk about your 6 years argument, right? So your evidence says that China will invade in 6 years if the US doesn't step up deterrence. So that means that the only chance that they invade is if US deterrence is low, right?
Correct.
So
Well,
is the US going to help Taiwan right now?
Well, our argument is very simple, that the United States or Taiwan, if by increasing defense investment, we can make sure that Taiwan has a conventional deterrence. This evidence is operating under the assumption that the United States is the sole actor that which can provide military protection, which is obviously going to be a little bit of a problem. Let's say the United States is not in the picture. However, our evidence indicates by giving military equipment to Taiwan, letting them develop their own military industrial base, then they can defend themselves, which is much better because just like Google Maps, like Taiwan's closer to China than the United States.
I agree.
Right.
The issue is that we're saying that Taiwan already has those capabilities because the arms sales to the US have been enough. Sure, you're saying that China might want to invade to look good internationally, but them being stuck in an invasion for several months or even several years would be more detrimental to their international image, and they would be heavily sanctioned, which I would say hurts them more.
Well, I think like you're making a lot of analysis without evidence, and our evidence indicates
the evidence we indicate says that A, the US could shut down China because they also have the Western support, and B, it also says that the costs always outweigh the benefits.
No, I'm talking about the evidence about the arms sales. Our evidence is very important. It indicates that defense investment on top of arms sales is what is needed to help protect Taiwan. We don't have evidence that's the
I get your evidence, but I'm just saying the incentive for them to invade Taiwan is much less than the effect and the consequences of an invasion. You just pointed to one thing and said that Xi wants to invade Taiwan. I'm saying that if it's going to be diverting billions of dollars away from things like healthcare and domestic issues, Xi doesn't want to invade Taiwan. He always wants to when you draw attention to Taiwan with a trade agreement.
I appreciate what Code 700 says on this issue, but the Hill evidence we talk about, which is an expert in international relations, and does analysis on Xi's history, actually explains that he does want to do that if the costs are low.
Then call for CNBC evidence, which says the exact opposite.
We have 8. Yeah. All right, we'll start now.
All right, it'll start on our argument about deterrence. Everybody good? Awesome. Please call for our Latham evidence. Our Latham evidence explains that China has been militarizing since 1996 in order to eventually launch an invasion on Taiwan. They explain that this time will come in about 6 years, which is why it is important to vote AF right now to give Taiwan the defensive investment and arms sales that they need to stop that invasion and deter Xi Jinping from doing that. Our evidence also concludes that Xi will be deterred by increased conventional deterrence and is extremely explicit that this is the only way we can deter China. We conclude that this invasion would lead to 240,000 lives being lost if it happens, which is the largest impact that affects lives in the round. All of their impacts are talking about things like economics or poverty, which can be solved for, but once a life is lost, it cannot be returned. That is why you are prioritizing the affirmative. The only 2 responses that they talk about in their summary speech are first, that Xi has focused on peace and diplomacy, but the flights that they say were only once happen almost daily where they fly over Taiwan to scare them, and more importantly, they have conceded the analysis that since 1996, they have been militarizing to both block the United States and invade Taiwan, 2 things that are clearly not peaceful. Just because they haven't invaded doesn't mean they won't, and they will in about 6 years. Please call for our evidence. The second argument they say is that we will sanction China. This is brand new in summary and also not true. We are much closer trade partners with China than Russia. They are not analogous. On their case, they are losing because of the overview at the top. Call for our Perry evidence, which explains that China does not see economic relations so long as you do not acknowledge Taiwan as a sovereign state as things that are official agreements. They say that it's from Perry, but no, Perry is citing the Chinese foreign minister, these same people they say are credible, and says that China does not consider economic agreements as official relations. Please call for that evidence. It explains that this would not anger China. On the impact they talk about, they have conceded that Taiwan has 60 days of oil reserves and that other countries can come to fill in during an energy crisis because they have that timeline. Taiwan has already prepared for this kind of cutoff from China, which is why they already have the resources to handle it. This means that the United States, especially with a bilateral trade agreement, can stop the energy crisis and no one falls into poverty. They say that this would devastate the economy and lead to an easy Taiwan-China invasion, but the economy doesn't get devastated when countless other nations can step in and sell them resources, including the exporters that currently go through China. That's me.
Alright. We'll take our remaining 8 seconds of time. Starting now. Ready? Alright, is everyone ready? Cool. Order will be starting on the affirmative case, weighing, and then ending on the negative case. If everyone's ready, then we'll start time now. Their entire case relies on this idea that suddenly we're going to have more deterrence through a bilateral trade agreement. But what they've ignored throughout the round is that this deterrence isn't necessary in the first place because China doesn't want to invade. All their evidence just says that China wants to invade to appear strong, but what we tell you is that historically, the only time that Xi has ever been aggressive is when he looks weak. He doesn't need to look strong if he doesn't look weak in the first place, which is what a bilateral trade agreement does. That's why historically, if we have shown that Taiwan already has the great defense to defend against China and still make an invasion more costly than any marginal benefits, that means there's no reason to vote for them, and that means there's no reason to have a bilateral trade agreement. But even further, the economic retaliation is always enough. They just say that we're closer to China and will never sanction them. Sure, we sanctioned China with the Uyghur Muslims just last year. If China is invading an entire foreign country, then all of our Western allies are going to get behind that because they don't want China to go around invading all of our allies. Again, the incentive to sanction is always there. That's why we tell you there's no risk of an invasion, and again, their weighing just makes no sense. They say lives come over the economy. They've conceded that hundreds of thousands of people went into poverty last time that China cut off imports, and that's what leads to debts, because when you have a country in poverty and they don't even have things like oil and gas, that leads to several debts. But even further, the weighing that we make throughout the round goes conceded. Insofar as China is able to block all imports to Taiwan, that means that the US cannot trade with Taiwan in the first place. That means we cannot build up deterrence or build diversification away from China. Ultimately, it destroys the cost of it destroys any benefits of a bilateral trade agreement in the first place. But with that, you go to our case. They make one response. They say that we all just have an economic agreement and a bilateral trade agreement doesn't threaten China. But what they've conceded is that we promised to China for the past 30 years, which is why Chinese foreign ministers have said specifically violating that promise is what threatens them and makes them look weak internationally, which is when they respond with sanctions and a blockade. Even further, they say that we already have reserves. Sure, we have reserves. Those will go up in 30 days, whereas we tell you that a blockade lasts internally, and it means that you can never have Taiwan recover. That only happens gradually with what we're doing right now. Don't risk all the trade we have right now. Vote con.
It's very round.
Great round, y'all. Yeah.
And thank you for judging.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for judging. Thank you.